All right. Hello, everybody. This is Matt Orozco from Macabre Daily. I'm fortunate enough to get two chances to speak with Anthony DiBlasi, the director, co-writer of MALUM. So, Anthony, I'm grateful again for you being here and taking this time. I
Or
have a bunch of different questions for you this time around. So, if it's all right with you, I'll just jump right into it.
yeah, for sure.
Well, Anthony, as I've shared with you last time, big fan of Malum. Review's already written. Just can't wait to post it till next week. And one of the
Uh,
things that I really noticed about your, particularly this film, but also your previous films like Extremity, Last Shift, The Books of Blood, even the work you did with Clive Barker's production company. What do you think draws you to some of the more transgressive elements of horror?
I mean, listen, first and foremost, what drew me to horror originally was the design of it, the makeup, specifically. Like I grew up um loving just effects and creature effects. And it's funny because I think the movies I tend to make are like the movies I watch every year, like every Halloween, I'll watch Fright Night, I'll watch Lost Boys. Those aren't the kind of movies I make for some reason. I, I I'm always drawn to much darker mythos, and I think and I was drawn to Clive in that way, like when I had first met him, and um when I was lucky enough to like interview with him, I had what Nightmare on Elm Street had come out on this awesome DVD box set, and he was all over that. The BTS was like, I don't know, it was like 14 hours of BTS on those discs,
Great box
and I was
set.
watching that. Yeah, I was watching that when I was in my senior year at college, and I was like, man, the way he talked about horror, he just it was so much more of a psychological thing, and it wasn't scary always. It's like facing horror is this just way to face death in a safe manner, or face these things we can't talk about every day, or things that people are too afraid to talk about every day, and then you sit in a room and you can really think about it and deep dive into it. And and with Dread and with Malum and Extremity, Dread and Extremity, I don't even know if I'd call them horror films in a way. They're just they're dramas where bad shit happens to people. But I love that I'm love, and even in if you go back and look at the genre films I've made, I love the fact that we can be going about our normal day. You could meet someone on the street and it can just completely alter your life, or you could get a phone call and you just take one just slight step off the path, and suddenly everything changes, and often for the worse, right? uh,
Yes.
you know, I like drawing a light on that. It's like, hey, be careful, like, who you talk to, or what you seek, what answers you seek, because you may not always like what you find.
You make a good point about kind of this element of the output doesn't always match the interest sometimes, as far as like there's a darkness in the output. And I think that's because when we want, the scariest things are the things that we kind of conjure up in our minds most of the time. And
Yeah.
I often find myself thinking, oh, it'd be so creepy if like this happened right now, and it's the kind of stuff that it's dark, but it's also, I think, what makes horror and genre fans in general kind of a different breed is that they're okay playing in that darkness for a little bit, but the most of them are just the kindest folks you've ever met. So it's not as if there's this personality thing. It's more about, I just really like to see something I've never seen, something that I
Yeah.
probably will hopefully never see, and
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
that, something that is, and from the design side, something that just tickles all the parts of your brain that are all about the imagination. And
Mhm.
as we talked about before, like the Russell FX work, I'm really excited for people to see what this looks like, because it's it's just sublimely grotesque and beautiful. It's like there's a lot of like,
Okay.
it's almost like when you read going back to Clive Barker for a moment, you read things like The Hellbound Heart. It's like
Yeah.
it's not a sickening book or anything like that. It's actually more sexual than it is kind of violent, but
Yeah.
there's a beauty in that. There's kind of this weird dark beauty in that, and I find that so fascinating, the harmonizing of those two worlds together, and the people behind them.
Yeah, it's interesting how I think like horror people who are into horror are often also collectors, right? Uh they 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 like we like me included, we fetishize these like representations of these things we love a lot. And it must go hand in hand, just like this, because horror is the one genre where you just get to touch on so many different things that I as a filmmaker love, both just visual and uh the I don't it's a weird representation of all these things like toys and imagery and posters and collectibles, and it's weird, I think, and that goes to the fascination of finding an effect that you're like, whoa, like I just want to stare at that for a while and like live in it for a while. And I guess it's growing up like a kid of the 80s and seeing those kinds of movies come to life where it's such like effects driven films, and you're like, how the fuck do they do that? I don't It's so cool, and yes, scary, but I really want to know how that was made, and I want to make that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think horror fans in general are always in search of community because most of us, I'd say up to a certain age, didn't have that when we were younger because we always kind of felt like I'm the weird one because I'm watching, Evil Dead in sixth
Yeah,
grade, right? But and who do I share that with? You can't tell your teacher because might think, they might tell your parents or something like that. So
yeah,
it is this kind of, now that we have this moment of, there is this kind of collectability and there's this kind of almost commercialization to some extent of horror, but that also gives us these totems that remind us of our passion. And
yeah,
I think that also exists in the film, and that's why horror fans, I think, seek out so many new films. We love to go back to the past, but we're also just as willing to dive into the future head first. And it's because we'll watch, a 90-minute movie. The first 60 minutes or 70 minutes are just kind of meandering almost, and then you get to that
yeah.
last 20, you're like, oh well, you gotta see the last 10 minutes of this movie, man, and then all of a sudden you've got a cult classic on your hands. So
I know, I know.
we're
We're
masochists
patient
in that way.
viewers. Yeah, we're masochists. Yeah, that's a better word.
And I know that some time has passed, since Last Shift and Malum, and I'm curious to know, like, from your perspective, what elements of your craft do you think have adapted or changed during that time, and how does that show up in Malum?
I think, well, I think with every movie you learn new things, and also perspective wise. I'd say, it's when I did Last Shift, I almost going into that movie, I said, this is my first horror movie, even though it kind of wasn't. And and producing side, working on like Midnight Meat Train and Book of Blood, obviously those are horror films, but Dread and Missionary and Casadega and these other movies that I did, it wasn't until Last Shift that I'm like, no, this is a horror movie. I'm making it for horror audiences. I'm not just making it for myself, like telling a story that is connecting with me. Like I want to tell. That was the movie I was like, hey, I want to make a movie that's going to entertain people and scare people, and that's my main objective. Um, and I think coming from producing, which was great because you learn every side of the business, the executive side, dealing with the agents and managers, just every part of it. I was always had a brain for figuring out like how to make something work. I think with this movie, I said, I'm not going to do that. I said, I'm not going to make something work. I'm going to make what I want the whole time. I don't care how grueling and painful it is for everyone involved, but we are going to do this. We're going to do it to the best of our ability. So I think like I'm at a point where now I'm less compromising, still amenable. I mean, I love working with everyone, and I'm like, I hate working on a set that's just has an air of like, why am I here? Why is everyone so mean? It happens a lot in entertainment. I don't know why
Yeah,
people
imagine.
are so I think it's because ego has a huge part of it. And when you feel you're doing something creative, you get tied up in it so much and you're like, oh, this is the most important thing in the world. And but you have to be able to collaborate with people. Like you have to make everyone's day joyous on set, even when you're doing terribly hard things. Because at the end of the day, we're making movies, we're not shoveling shit. So let's be thankful that we're making movies,
Yeah, I mean, your passion can't
but
be
not
counterproductive.
compromise.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it has to be, it has to be collaborative, and I think that's when the best work comes together is when everyone's on the same team. They may not be on the same page, but they're on the same team, focusing on the output. And to your credit, you've brought some of the most difficult Clive Barker stories to the screen. Particularly Midnight Meat Train, and if anyone who's seen it, the ending, I mean, it's just as good as it is in the book, and it's just as weird as it is in the book, but there's something to that I think horror keeps you on your toes, and you can tell when and also part of that's with working with folks like Ryuhei Kitamura, who Versus was the first. I remember having to order Versus from a comic book store because it wasn't available in the US, and hoping that the
Yeah.
DVD arrived like two years later or something like that.
Yeah.
um,
And it
but
played.
yeah, and it played, fingers crossed, but it
Yeah.
but all those things, it's kind of it makes you can just see it in the output, and I think that that's part of my favorite part about speaking with folks like yourself and also watching genre films, is that you can tell that I've never met anyone who's like, oh, I just gonna make a horror movie, like, it's no big deal, like people are like, no, I'm making a horror movie, and they get really into it.
Yeah.
And that's I don't want to say that's unique to horror, but I find that maybe there's a lot of people with a similar mindset in the genre versus maybe others. It might be easier just to phone it in.
Yeah. When and it goes back to like making a horror movie is just extremely fun. Like you don't like I've made other genres and it's always great to dive in and tell a story in a very paced and mannered way. But in horror, it's like anything goes. You're dealing with effects, you're pushing people to their limits physically and mentally, and you can also add great comedy in horror, and you can add great levity, a great heart and emotion, which is always like I love it when I watch a horror movie that I'm like, wait, I'm affected by it on an emotional level, because I don't think that's often the goal for horror. It's mainly like let's give them gross outs, or let's scare them, or let's. But when you find that movie that's like, wait, that affected me in a different way, I think that's awesome and refreshing. And that like, there's not a lot of genres where you can do all of that
Yeah,
and
horror
connect.
does have this broadness to it almost, because anything could be a horror movie, right? Just depending on your perspective.
Yeah, yeah,
But it's almost compared to like, going to that, cheap carnival ride that you see like at those pop-up carnivals, is like the more narrative experience that's more emotionally connected to something like at a Universal Studios or a Disneyland, where it's all about
yeah.
that experience versus just the shock and the awe in the moment. And on the note of kind of shocking and awing and even creature designs, was there anything that you wanted to do in Malum that were like, oh, this is going to be so great, but it just didn't work out? Or was everything you had in your head like on display in the final product?
Well, I think that like goes back to the not compromising thing. I mean, when I do a movie, I'm very involved with the budget, because it's like, okay, and if you're a filmmaker that's able to be very involved with the budget, you should be, because it's like you got to examine every dollar and where's it going, and try to make sure the departments you want are getting that money. So like in that pre-production stage, it was very much like there's a lot of effects in this movie, and there were things that, sure, like if I had 100 things in the film, through the writing process, you have your like, all right, here's the hero effects, and we're going down the list, and then you're like, I could change that, I could change that. But oftentimes when you get to the bottom of the list and you're like, yeah, I don't want to spend more money there, you find something more creative to do, and it also sets it apart from everything else in the movie. You're like, oh, well, if I can't spend money here, what else can I do to make it cool? But I don't think I think because it's the process. If effects are hard, like when you're on set working with effects, it slows everything like to a grinding halt at times, because effects never work. Like usually on the special makeup effects and things like that, they never work the way you want them to the first. It's very rare, right? There's always, it's just, and that's to no one's fault. That's just the nature of it. It's like that on every movie. So I think you get as much as you can in camera, and some of it's amazing and some of it's like, oh, that's not great, but I know I have enough to get to the end result through either editing or pickups, because we do that too. We did several days of pickups after we wrapped production, to go in and get more and more details. And then and then in pre-production, you're planning like, I'm going to help this out with VFX, or this is going to be a little bit of VFX. And then, so I think I got to the end result. I was like, and it may have only happened a week ago, but like, okay, it's done. It's exactly what I wanted. But there you go. I think you just have to know, like, and that comes with experience and relying on your peers, that you'll get there. Even if you think on set, oh, fuck, we didn't get there. But you got to know, oh, we'll get there when it's all said and done.
I mean, Natalie said something similar just now, which is like, you just got to keep going. Whatever
Yeah.
the roadblock is, you just got to keep going. And I think your production background specifically helps with that kind of budget mindset, because you're right, the ideas are easy, but the execution is the part that people get caught up in. And, everyone wants to have that $100 million shot or something like that. But the reality is, like, not everyone can have that. And my last question for you is kind of more broad to any aspiring filmmakers. What advice would you give them, aside from being budget minded, would you give them if they're trying to start out in the genre and they want to get their work out there?
Well, I'd say, never strive for perfection, because I think perfection is what stops people from progress. Whenever I see people like wanting to make something or wanting to write something, it's all about like, well, I got to do it. It has to be this way. I'm like, no, just do it. Do something. Like, just get it on the page. Especially now, there's so much technology at your disposal. It's like,
Yeah.
and in this genre specifically, you could literally take your iPhone, go shoot a movie on the weekends for a few months, and the genre will accept that, because it's like, we like that.
Yep.
It feels wrong. It feels like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It feels like the Blair Witch Project. Like it. Another good example of that is not in the horror genre at all, but a movie called Once, which is this like amazing love story. That movie looks
that
like
movie's beautiful.
I don't know what they shot that on, and it's when I saw it in theaters, I was like, whoa! Like, you watch it and it's so lo-fi, and it's just great. It's just great, and you could make a movie like that.
It's
So
testament to
do
great
it.
characters. I mean, Once
Yeah,
has some amazing characters and music, of course, but I think that's the key. And even in films like Malum, is that you want these character, like, you want this character to succeed, and you want them to exist, even though you want to see them put through the gauntlet, you also want to see them succeed as well. So it's
yeah,
kind of, you're rooting for them, even though you're kind of putting them in peril at the same time.
yeah, yeah. Good. I'm glad that comes across.
Well, Anthony, I know we're up at time, but I just want to thank you again for the opportunity to have this conversation. To reminder all watching this, that Malum will be out nationwide Friday, March 31st, 2023. Please go and see it in a theater with people, because you just want to be there to feel that energy in the room. And thank you again, Anthony. Best of luck with the release.
Thank you so much.